Russia has not adhered to the agreement. This should have been done years ago. It's a threat to whoever you want, and it includes China, and it includes Russia, and it includes anybody else that wants to play that game.
The Trump administration announced it's producing a new small nuke to counter Russia's own tactical nuclear weapons. Critics fear the plan could mark the return to the darkest days.
Is the Pentagon's newest toy, the W76-2, and it is essentially a mini nuke. Less bang, less radiation, less fallout, and most importantly, less responsibility.
I think it's time for a new meeting and for the major countries that have nuclear weapons to meet and develop a new treaty or a new agreement that restricts what can be developed and what cannot be developed, and having countries adhere to that treaty so that there's not one dominant country in the world that can take advantage of other countries.
Naturally, this new nuclear arms race is not America's fault, but everyone else's, namely the usual suspects.
Since 2010, we have seen the return of great power competition. To varying degrees, Russia and China have made clear that they seek to substantially revise the post-Cold War international order and norms of behavior.
Russia has not adhered to the agreement. This should have been done years ago. It's a threat to whoever you want, and it includes China, and it includes Russia, and it includes anybody else that wants to play that game.
We could, of course, beat a dead horse and, again, point out that Russia is not even in the same league as the US when it comes to military budgets. In fact, Russian military spending has been falling for years, while America's has ballooned. Symbolic as well. Within days, the US should begin withdrawing from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, blaming Russia's development of a cruise missile. But really gets on the old nerves here is the Commander-in-Chief of the United States, his unpredictability and seemingly his habit of threatening everyone.
We have more money than anybody else by far. We'll build it up. So we have a tremendous amount of money to play with on our militaries, and we are going to develop the weapons. Funding to modernize our nuclear arsenal is so important. We're spending a tremendous amount of money on our nuclear arsenal.
Now, 2 minutes to midnight on the doomsday clock, on the brink, or now officially into a new Cold War, a nuclear arms race. World powers at each other's throats and no light at the end of the tunnel.
Countries will continue to make threats against other countries, just like what's happening now on the different trade negotiations around the world. A major trade negotiation now between China and the United States. And the exercise, sometimes these threats, we'll do this, we'll put tariffs on, and so on. Well, the same thing happens militarily, and from a national security standpoint, countries like to sort of pound their chest a little bit and make threats against another country if they don't agree with what they're doing.
With the Saudi Crown Prince heralds a possible nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's first in line to the Saudi throne, recently sat down for the first U.S. television interview with a Saudi leader in over a decade. In clips released by CBS News, the 32-year-old Crown Prince said, quote, "Saudi Arabia does not want to acquire any nuclear bomb, but without a doubt, if Iran developed a nuclear bomb, we will follow suit as soon as possible." The full interview will air March 18th on 60 Minutes. Saudi Arabia has criticized the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which calls for Iran to limit its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. Likewise, U.S. President Donald Trump has threatened to withdraw from the agreement if it's not amended. Prince Mohammed and Trump are scheduled to meet next week at the White House.
And here on set by our international affairs commentator, Douglas Herbert. The fascinating things about this, Doug, biggest exercises since the Cold War and China's involvement as well.
Yeah, and those two headlines really go side by side. Let's start with what's going on here. Why the biggest? Why do you have to go back to Ronald Reagan in 1981 when the Cold War was top of his priority list? Why do you have to go back to that to find anything even remotely similar? Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that relations have been slightly sour lately between Vladimir Putin's Russia and Europe and the US. And it's really, they really took that sort of tailspin, I'd say, after the annexation of Crimea, Russia's aggression in eastern Ukraine. All of these have added up to a sense that a lot of wariness, a lot of distrust about the other's motives. Vladimir Putin has looked very warily at what he perceives as NATO's aggressive buildup on its Eastern European flank, what you noticed, talked about. And it's true that NATO has deployed more troops, more equipment to Poland, to the Baltic states, in a bid to perhaps have a shield against what it sees as more Russian aggression.
Russia has not adhered to the agreement. This should have been done years ago. It's a threat to whoever you want, and it includes China, and it includes Russia, and it includes anybody else that wants to play that game.
Vladimir Putin, basically, with these exercises, he is responding. He's basically responding with defiance. He is showing, we see your threat, what he perceives as a threat, and we up your ante a little bit. We are ready to see down any potential threat to us. Now, let's be clear. Moscow denies, despite what you said, 300,000 Russian troops. That's a third of Russia's available army, okay? All of those tens of thousands of armored tanks. Russia denies these exercises are to prepare for any large-scale conflict. They do say is they are a reflection and coming amid a time of international, they're part of the international climate, the tension right now, at a time when they say they are frequently the targets of aggressiveness, where the West is being unfriendly towards Russia as Russia sees it. So it is a show of force. And as one of the Russia General Army Chief of Staff says, it's going to include massive airstrikes, cruise missile training, defensive and offensive operations, raids, bypass operations. It's going to include all of the things you associate normally with if you were to have to fend off a large-scale military conflict or operation.
China involved here then, Doug, invited for the first time. What's Putin's strategy?
This is a remarkable headline. It's almost like you can't put it in enough boldface. Look, right? No, when I say that, not to just be sensational. It's true for a century, for decades. Russia and China were traditional adversaries. They share a 4,200 kilometer, a 3,000 something mile border. They clashed repeatedly. Russia's always been wary of China as a competitor, wanting it to encroach on its vast Siberian territory. And here they are, cooperating militarily. Well, look, it's part of a pattern in recent years, and it goes hand in hand with what I was just saying. The tenser international climate with the West, with the U.S., has sort of brought Russia and China closer into each other's orbits in not just military cooperation, right, which they are doing today, but also in the areas of trade, of investment, of energy cooperation in oil and gas projects, all of that. So it's part and parcel of a broader sort of rapprochement between these two powers, superpowers, which have been very wary of each other, but now perhaps both are even more wary of the United States. That said, even though Russia's cooperated with China, even though China has thousands of troops as well participating in 900 armored tanks and other equipment, I suspect there's still an element of wariness in there still, that Russia still looks at China as a potential competitor, probably doesn't want to give everything away. Some of its troops are going to be training and doing their exercises far from the Chinese troops.
Comes just as well, doesn't it, as the US has been launching exercises in Syria. I mean, that was reportedly
Right.
in response to a Russian threat there as well.
What's going on there? Last week, you had the deployment, you had Russian military exercises in southern Syria, and what it was in response to reported Russian threats, Russians saying that they were going to be entering territory in southern Syria near a base where the U.S.-led coalition is based and has operations. And it was in response to that threat that the U.S. started to conduct its own large-scale military exercises around the base at Antonov, and basically trying to say, publicly saying they want the Russians to see for themselves, look up into the sky and see just how ready the U.S. would be to see down any potential threat. And it also comes, let's not forget, after the Russians had deployed their own flotilla of warships right off Syria's coast in the Mediterranean, and at a time, as we're all waiting, perhaps any day now, imminently, for a potential Syrian offensive on Idlib, the last rebel-held enclave in Syria, with the Russian and Iranian allies. So a very tense climate there. What's going on in Syria, part and parcel of this broader equation that helps to explain these giant, unprecedented military exercises, which are taking part in the east of Russia, across the expanses of Siberia as well.
The view there of Doug Herbert, our international affairs commentator here on France 24. Thanks, Doug.
The Russian president has criticized the U.S. threats to pull out of a Cold War-era treaty that bans short and medium-range ballistic missiles. Vladimir Putin said that it is hard to predict the consequences of a U.S. withdrawal from the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty signed in 1987. He also warned that the threat of nuclear war should not be underestimated. Putin further hoped that common sense will prevail. The Russian leader made the remarks at his annual end-of-the-year news conference. Regarding the recent standoff with Ukraine, he accused President Poroshenko of seeking to increase his rating by staging provocations in the Black Sea. Putin said the fate of the captured Ukrainian sailors will be decided once the trial is over. John Stepling is an author and commentator who joins us to share with us his thoughts on this. Well, if the U.S. was trying to, in any shape of the word, maintain or eliminate nuclear weapons, well, it's definitely not done so. And then we can see what the Russian president has responded, John Stepling, in his annual address. And I'm quoting, the threshold, lowering the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons could lead to a global catastrophe. This might lead to the collapse of civilization and the planet. And he said it is right not to underestimate the threat of nuclear war. That's what the Russian president has said. Is this what the U.S. wanted in reaction?
You know, who knows what the United States wanted, but it was a very cogent statement. And it's kind of wonderful that he said it with that kind of clarity. The U.S. has been itching to use some form of nuclear weapon. They allegedly did, in fact, in Afghanistan several years ago, what they think of as tactical nukes, micro-yield nukes and so forth. But, you know, the danger is there regardless, which should be very obvious. The U.S. has been the agent of provocation here. They have surrounded with NATO Russia's borders. They have issued sanctions based on nothing. There is all the propaganda about Russiagate and so forth. If any country is guilty of interfering in elections, it's the United States. They have even interfered in Russian elections in the past. But that's not how propaganda works, and we know all of that. I think that Russia and Putin have been extraordinarily restrained in their reactions. You know, given the 2014 coup, fascist coup, that John Brennan and Nuland and Hillary Clinton orchestrated in Ukraine. You know, the provocations go on, and Russia has been very circumspect and very measured in what they have tried to do. At the same time, they've been very effective in fighting off the terrorists in Syria and helping Assad. You know, they work with China on the Silk Road project. All of these things are hedges, in a sense, against U.S. imperialism, which is the great world danger. I think everybody can agree. And the U.S. is kind of recolonizing Africa and has bases in nearly every African country. It's occupied Afghanistan for 17 years, Iraq, and so on. Russia has done none of those things. And here you have the Russian president making a very clear statement about the danger, the catastrophic, you know, the catastrophe that would follow from a nuclear war. I mean, it would be the end of humankind. And yet this is, if you read Western media, U.S. media, is something that never gets mentioned, really, not in those terms. It's a very militaristic society. All you have to do is watch Hollywood movies or listen to the White House to see the truth of that. So it was a very important statement in a certain sense. Of course, you know, it won't be covered in Western media the way we're talking about it right now. The same way like the Yellow Vests protests in France are not being covered in Western media. The U.S. is very selective about what it wants the public to see and hear these days. But nonetheless, the word will get out. Nonetheless, many of the NATO countries heard it. All of the leaders heard it. People in South Asia, China, Iran, everybody heard what Putin said, and it was important that he said it that way. And the U.S. is the one that tore up the treaty, and it's a very dangerous situation.
Thank you, John Stepling-Othman, commentator there.
According to NBC News, a senior North Korean defector has said that the country's desperate dictator is prepared to use nuclear weapons to strike the United States and its allies. Tae Yong-ho is the most high-profile North Korean defector in 2 decades, meaning he is able to give a rare insight into the secretive authoritarian regime. According to Tae, North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un is desperate in maintaining his rule by relying on his development of nuclear weapons and the ICBM. ICBM is an acronym for Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles, a long-range rocket that in theory would be capable of hitting the U.S.
The US is set to send more of its nuclear arsenal to Europe, according to a German news channel. 20 nuclear bombs with a total explosive force 80 times greater than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima will be based in Germany. Well, the move might, however, be against a decision made in the German Bundestag. Well, let's get live now from Peter Oliver. Peter, hi, good to see you.
Hello.
So, whose decision is this to make?
Well, ultimately, it's the decision of the German government and German Chancellor Angela Merkel whether or not to allow the US to hold these weapons on German territory. Now, the reason it's come as a bit of a shock, this news that the nuclear arsenal will be upgraded, is because back in 2010, the German Bundestag, well, they all voted to put pressure on the German government to make sure that they told the Americans to get their weapons off German territory.
The German parliament calls on its federal government to demand the US to withdraw American nuclear weapons from the territory of Germany.
Well, back in 2009, the mantra really regarding US nuclear weapons on German territory was that they were not in the will of most Germans. In fact, Angela Merkel herself backed the plans to try and reduce or in fact remove entirely all of this nuclear arsenal from German territory. However, 6 years on from that, 5 years on from Parliament voting to try and push the government to do this, we're now seeing that US nuclear capabilities on German soil aren't going to be removed. They're going to be made bigger, better and more accurate. All this news coming out right now regarding those weapons on the bases in the Rhineland.
And Peter, has there been any international reaction so far?
Well, understandably, the Russian Foreign Ministry has put out a statement. They've said that these actions go against Articles 1 and 2 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, this is a treaty signed between Russia and the United States, designed not to spread nuclear arms around the world. But we've also heard from people here in Germany, particularly senior former parliamentarians who were involved in Angela Merkel's own party during previous parliaments, saying that the only reason they would allow these weapons to be put in place and for them to be upgraded would be to try and provoke Russia.
These new attack options against Russia are consciously provoking our Russian neighbor.
Well, many back in 2010 would have expected that in 2015 would be talking about US nuclear weapons leaving bases in Germany. It seems that over the next few months we'll be seeing the nuclear capabilities of Washington in its German allies' territory increased and improved.
According to Reuters, Iran says it has many options to neutralize the reimposition of U.S. sanctions on its oil exports, adding that Tehran's regional influence could not be curbed as demanded by Washington. Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, Ali Shamkhani, said that Iran has plans in place that will neutralize the illegal U.S. sanctions against Iran's oil exports. We have many ways to sell our oil. Iranian officials have threatened to disrupt oil shipments from the Gulf countries if Washington tries to strangle Tehran's oil exports.
Russia is firing back at President Trump's new threat to pull out of a landmark nuclear weapons treaty. One Russian official warns breaking the pact would be a very dangerous step. Here's Roxana Saberi.
As worries about a new arms race between the U.S. and Russia intensify, the 3-decade-old treaty requiring the two countries to eliminate missiles like these could be coming to an end.
Russia has not, unfortunately, honored the agreement, so we're going to terminate the agreement. We're going to pull out.
After a rally in Nevada Saturday, President Trump said he wants to withdraw from the agreement unless Russia and China, which isn't a party to the pact, comply.
If Russia's doing it and if China's doing it and we're adhering to the agreement, that's unacceptable.
The treaty was signed in 1987 by President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. It bans the U.S. and Soviet Union from possessing, producing, and test flying ground-launched missiles with a range of around 300 to 3,400 miles. President Trump can pull the U.S. out of the pact unilaterally, but some lawmakers, including Republican Senator Rand Paul, say it's a bad idea.